Good afternoon, Tim.
Good afternoon, Mark.
I'll introduce myself, and then I'll let you introduce yourself. I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm the executive editor of the American Prospect magazine.
And I am Tim Noah. I am a senior writer for Slate Magazine, speaking to you today from the Tenleytown bureau of Slate Magazine.
Okay, great. Well, we don't have one of those, but if we did, it would be a Chevy Chase DC bureau, not too far away.
Right.
But I am right now downtown.
I'm showing off to viewers my new office. I've just moved into this house, so
okay.
I'm still house proud. Okay,
congratulations. Nice.
Thank you.
Well, before we get into, nobody wants to hear people talk about real estate. But although maybe we'll talk about that at the end, but not our own. Hopefully not our own, unless you're not foreclosed on yet, since you just moved in, wherever.
Right.
So I don't know, a couple of interesting things to talk about. There's a funny little debate, I think sort of interesting, who takes sides on the question of in the Kentucky Senate race, Jack Conway, the Democrat, ran an ad about Rand Paul's what's called the Aqua Buddha episode, I guess, when Paul was in college at Baylor and sort of semi-kidnapped a female student and forced her to worship the Aqua Buddha, which I thought I've assumed was a bong, but I'm not really sure. It could be anything, right? In any event, there's different takes on what
she was asked to. I don't think they put this in the ad, but she was asked to. To smoke to partake of a bong that was being shared between the college student,
right? And that is what the ad
that was left out of
right?
the ad.
Right, that was left out of the ad, but that's what I mean, and I don't think it was really clear in the stories I read about it either. But that's what I kind of inferred, I think. But so I guess you're better informed about this, and my inference was correct.
This all came from the source on this was a GQ story from last summer,
right?
Written by Jason Zengerle, and about this college prank,
right?
Involving this society that was profoundly irreverent towards religion and worshipped Aqua Buddha. And I think before we proceed, Mark, I must ask you to bow before Aqua Buddha.
I'm saying all my bongs are in storage. I know.
I hereby bow before Aqua Buddha. I am bowing before. You can't see, but I am bowing before Aqua Buddha.
Good. I have nothing. I'm too irreligious to do that. I worship no graven images or otherwise.
And I guess the question is this an unbelievably cheap knock on Rand Paul?
Right.
And I would argue...
Which surprisingly, I mean, Josh Marshall, I think, was one who really thought it was, which was a little surprising, I think.
I think it was, and I think there are so many good bites to be taken out of Rand Paul that why would you want to go for this one? But they seem to be going after it pretty aggressively. I think they're also, isn't the campaign also making an issue of his fealty to Ayn Rand or Ayn Rand or however you pronounce it, because she was an evangelical atheist.
Yes, although I'm not sure that's in an ad, or if it is, I haven't seen that ad. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, it's cheesy and it's stupid to. I mean, it's sort of incorrect to treat the Aqua Buddha thing as if it's some actual deity that Rand Paul worshipped. But it is interesting that
there is a striking amount of idolatry in these midterm elections, though, between this and O'Donnell's youthful dabbling in witchcraft.
Yeah.
This is kind of the Halloween election,
right? Exactly. Whereas I think the witchcraft. I think the word witchcraft has gotten attached to something that really just involved watching too many Billy Idol videos in O'Donnell's case. I think we're reading a little too much into the whole thing of being a witch. But in Paul's case, I mean, the thing about it is what it does is it goes right at the kind of the difficulty of actually, if you really are a pure libertarians do not mesh well with being social conservatives, and the pose that Paul's been able to take of, I'm a deeply evangelical Christian, in a very, in a very religious state, it's something you want to jab at, because obviously that's not quite who he really always was, certainly not who he always was. And it's not that Aqua Buddha was his god. Seriously. It's not that it was, but obviously there was this this was not a person who was in any way, even in a place like Baylor, where you have to be kind of aggressive about being, irreligious and irreverent towards religion. It's not sort of in the, it's not sort of in the norm of things the way it is at, I think where you and I went to college. I don't know. I think
we were at our right. We went to colleges that were so open-minded that we were actually encouraged to worship Aqua Buddha.
Right, or whatever.
Campus administration in the name of multiculturalism.
Exactly.
But yes, it's. I mean, the whole thing is
comparative religion is all.
My question is:
my wife,
a forgiving God, or is he a vengeful God? Do you know?
Oh yeah, I think the sinners in the hands of a wrathful, angry Aqua Buddha. I see him picking us up and dropping us into the fiery pit. If we talk about him, too much. You could be damn sure he watches. You may not see everything, but he definitely watches Blogging Heads.
I think Aqua Buddha's main concern is that you're not harsh as mellow, actually. It's a silly ad. What's the latest on? I mean, I meant to check before we started talking what the latest poll numbers are out of that race.
I think Conway has been down. I think he's down by only 2 points now.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously you have to raise doubts. I mean, I remember a pollster once saying to me, like the most powerful message in a campaign is kind of, who is this guy? Most powerful negative message is to get you thinking, I thought I knew this guy, but I'm not sure I'm not sure this is the person I thought this person or this woman is. And as an ad that sort of, obviously Conway had to go straight at this question of, do you really know who Rand Paul is? Which is actually, I think, a very valid question for a sort of dubious character. He's an ophthalmologist who created his own certifying agency for ophthalmology. He's not certified through the traditional boards. He's got some thing of his own. I mean, I think that's the question you have to raise in order to compete in that race, and it's a valid question.
It is a valid question, but there are so many things you can throw it. I remember talking to somebody who shall go nameless, who was working on that campaign a few months ago, who said that that Paul's defense of BP around the time of the spill was his real Achilles heel. But it doesn't seem as though much has been made of that lately. If it has, we haven't been hearing about it here, far away in Washington. That seems a legitimate bite to take out of Paul. But anyway, so we are agreed that there is something a little distasteful about the Aqua Buddha commercial.
Tim, I didn't hear what you said just now. There's something weird going on with sound.
We are agreed that although it's legitimate to say who is this guy, that the Aqua Buddha commercial is a little off base, or no? Are you not sure that it's off base?
Tim, are you hearing me?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me? Okay.
No, I'm not, and it may be something weird with my connection because I'm actually using Skype to call you. Speak again. See if it cleared up.
Can you hear me now? Hello.
I hear you. There's just too much of an echo.
Oh dear. I guess we need to start this again.
Oh, now I think you're fine. You're fine now.
Oh, we're fine. Okay.
You're fine now. We'll just go back to. We'll just hope for the best. Usually I do this and it works fine.
Oh, okay, great. Anyway, my question was, so are we agreed that this commercial was off base?
No, I think it's, it's funny because
you think it was fun.
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually on the high-minded side. When things split, the high-minded and the crude do anything, I'm usually on the high-minded side. In this case, no, I think it's a terrific ad, and I think it's perfectly fine to go with those at that question of just how kind of weird and flaky Paul is. It certainly isn't. It probably isn't among the top 15 horrible ads of this election cycle. So I don't really have a problem with it.
Well, what if they had added that he smoked weed? Would that take it off base? Right, because that was part of the GQ story. I mean, right. This really makes no sense. The ad sends you back to the GQ story. The GQ story tells you that Rand Paul smoked dope when he was in college. Do people care about that anymore? And is it distasteful to encourage people to remember
that? Let's see. I mean, I'm strongly pro dope smoking. I think if some. I mean, I think that's fine. If that's something that would make people think this isn't somebody I want representing me in Congress, then I think it's perfectly fine to raise it. I mean, I think the whole story involved there's a certain weirdness, there's a certain abusiveness of a fellow student that's not fully clear to me. There's a lot to the story that says, I mean, it has to at some level say something about Rand Paul.
Well, on the other hand, we had a president of the United States who served 2 terms, named George W. Bush, whose first appearance in the public prints was in a New York Times article when he was in college about his fraternity, the Deeks, burning new inductees with cigarettes.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's actually, I mean, to me, those things about George W. Bush actually were significant, and I went to the same college, and I knew Deeks, and I know the whole, it was familiar to me, so I knew the thing, and you knew people like Rand Paul, and, they were assholes in college, and most of them are still assholes, It's a reasonable thing. George Bush was an asshole. He's still, that was worth knowing.
Uh-huh. Worth knowing, but worth putting in an ad. I guess there are different gradations here.
Right, and of course,
worth writing up in GQ if you're Jason Zingerle, but is it worth putting in an ad?
Right. Well, and also you're saying different things. I mean, I read that story and thought, this is a sort of George W. Bush type jerk who probably still is a little bit of a jerk. Obviously, I wasn't going from a very high position of regard for Rand Paul. It wasn't like my view of him was brought down significantly, but I understood him obviously in a different way reading the story. The ad's telling you something different. The ad's trying to tell you like he worships some strange, not the God of the Bible, which obviously isn't really the point, but I don't care. I mean,
I guess I could get behind the ad if it had focused on a different question, which was what the hell is a supposed libertarian doing participating in a kidnapping?
Well, there's that. Yeah. There's a lot of things.
Unless you have a complex argument that says in a truly libertarian state we are free to kidnap each other. But then you get into a endless late night bull session. He didn't graduate from Baylor, but he went to Paul didn't graduate from Baylor, but he went to med school anyway, which I didn't even know you could do.
If you create your own med school, and the dean is Aqua Buddha, PhD. I don't,
I think he went to Duke medical school.
Well,
that's
there you have it.
For another day.
My brother actually teaches at Duke Medical School, so
he does?
Yeah, that's how low the standards are. Now he teaches physical anthropology, but they teach anatomy. He and his wife both have always taught anatomy to medical students. But no, it's a legitimate med school, I believe. I don't know how you do that without graduating.
Well, moving on in this.
Very carefully.
I think we need to call this the Animal House edition of Blogging Heads, because we are now moving on to more adolescent hijinks, which is the Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert rally scheduled for October 30th. I wrote a piece this week which has gotten 500, at last count, 500 responses.
Wow.
From people who do not strike me as the usual crowd that responds to my pieces on Slate. Almost all negative. The piece basically urged Colbert and Stewart to stay home, to cancel their rally. I think they have actually started something which even they themselves wish they hadn't. What worries me, as I said in the piece, is that while yes, they see this as a new and interesting forum for political satire. I think that when you are participating in a rally, it gives a political valence to what you are saying that doesn't happen when, say, you're writing a book or appearing on Comedy Central. And then, in fact, a lot of their followers, actually I didn't say this, but I'm saying this now, a lot of their followers do seem to take Stewart Colbertism quite seriously as a political movement. My eyes were opened up to that by the 500 plus responses to my piece, most of which said,
I lost you again.
Don't you... Up. Can you hear me now? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, hi, Tim.
Yeah. Anyway...
I lost you again at followers.
You lost me at followers. Can you hear me now? Hello?
It's echoing again. I'm sorry.
Okay, Mark? Hello?
You know what, Tim? I'm going to, leave your camera. I'm just going to call you on the regular line, and we'll keep this going, and maybe they can just edit.
Or I'll just provide a little entr'acte here while you're. Well, call me right back.
Okay, I'm going to call you I'm going to call you back on the regular line.
Okay. Mark is going to call me back, so I am going to amuse you now for just a few minutes by giving you a tour of my new office. This is my new office, and as you can see, there are portraits, self-portraits that my son and daughter have drawn. It was an assignment they had in school. And there are my bookshelves, and I'm having some other bookshelves built. And I'm awfully glad that Mark is back so I can stop making a fool of myself. Okay. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Jim. Sorry,
I was giving Blogging Heads viewers a tour of my office. So
okay, good. All right. I was giving them a blank screen. And I have the handset thing, which I'm always trying to avoid, but that's fine.
Okay.
Plenty of people do it. Okay, so we're back to Jon Stewart. We're back on track.
Yeah, and the worry in a nutshell for me is that this will actually come across as something that has the feel of a genuine political rally, and I just don't think that that mockery is a good form of political expression. I think it's a terrific form of political satire, but not a good form of political expression. And that's essentially what I said in my piece.
Right.
And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts are, I'm not going, but I don't really have a problem with it. I mean, I think that the political rally has been, it's kind of turned into this entirely symbolic ritual, so that you have actually wind up with Glenn Beck sort of doing a kind of imitation of the March on Washington. You and I have both seen it, how in Washington protest has become completely, it's just sort of built into the routine it's as routine as, a steak dinner for lobbyists and Mortons. It's just part of the system. The DC police know how to handle it. It has no disruptive power at all anymore. In the way
does it have any meaning anymore?
Does it have any meaning?
It has no meaning?
I don't know that it has any meaning. I met somebody a couple weeks ago who handed me his card. He runs a blog that's called QuotidianDissent.com, and it's a blog about protests in Washington. And I thought that was a great name for it, because it is just quotidian. It's just this routine, this day-to-day routine. You try to get your crowd count to a certain amount or whatever. I mean, it's so far left behind what the March on Washington was all about, or even say the Rally for Women's Lives in the late '90s, which was a fairly huge turnout. I mean, those there were a few of those in the '90s that kind of captured that, but it's become such a little ritual on both sides that it's almost worth just engaging in the kind of half real, half symbolic nature of it, and it's certainly more. And what's interesting to me also is that people are a lot more interested in going to this than they were in that ridiculous interest group march 2 weeks ago.
And that was ridiculous because
nobody really came, nobody's really engaged. It was planned really hastily. It was a kind of reaffirmation of like we these organizations, many of which are people I'm really close to and admire greatly. It's like we have to redefine. We're actually the organized left, and people better come to our rally rather than Jon Stewart's. There was a kind. It was similarly kind of like pro forma. Like this is what you do if you're serious. Is you have to have a rally and you have to get X number of people to stand and listen to speeches for a little while. I mean, I'm not sure it has anything to do with anything except in those in very rare moments.
I guess I disagree, and I think the perspective you are not taking into account are participating as opposed to those of us who were watching or not watching it on TV. I think it's actually quite meaningful to the participants. I think even the AFL-CIO rally from a few weeks ago was quite meaningful to the participants. I don't think it was pro forma. I think liberal groups are actually genuinely alarmed by the predicted loss of the House of Representatives.
Right. But then there are lots of things that you could do, and spending an afternoon standing on the Mall doesn't seem like...
Well, somebody could have told Martin Luther King that 50 years ago. And
well, but that's exactly my point. I mean, King didn't organize that rally. That rally was, that was a year or more in the making. It was a very significant way of really bringing attention to a cause that hadn't quite reached that.
And it was remembered for only one thing, which was this speech that was given by Martin Luther King.
Right. Well, it's also remembered for the sheer number of people who came, the effort that they put in to getting there, the passion of it, the fact that people thought, nothing good could come of something like that. That it was
right.
Enormously peaceful, which is also true actually of the Million Man March. I mean, if you remember, people were just terrified of that in the mid '90s. I mean, it was a lot of stuff. A lot happened with that. I'm not saying. I guess the point I'm making is I remember a friend of mine said to me years ago that we use the word movement really. Like I'm always around people who use the phrase the campaign finance movement, which is a number of people possibly in the hundreds that really we use the word movement really casually, and there really is there's the civil rights movement and not much else. The women's movement, obviously you can rank things down from there, but pretty quickly you get to things that don't have nearly the moral salience or the actual popular reach to be called a movement. And I think you're sort of saying that for Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert to engage in this kind of movement tactics sort of cheapens the word. And I think that I think that we're kind of past that.
Well, there are,
and I'm sure it's valuable. I mean, if the point is your point is that these things are valuable to the people to participate. I mean, they are. Yeah. I mean, the people who are participating. I mean, people are enthusiastic. It's great for them. They want to participate in the Stewart rally. It's a kind of exciting way of expressing the perspective that they have in American politics.
There are two responses to my, there are these 500-odd comments that have appeared on site. Some of them are along the lines of what you're... some of them are along the lines of what you're saying, which is, look, it's a comedy show. It's a comedy show that borrows the format of a political rally. Lighten up. Which is an argument I might have more room for if it weren't for the fact that many, many more people are making a much more alarming argument, which is, what do you mean when you say this is just a comedy show? This is a political movement. America must turn to its comedians for leadership. They're the only honest politicians left in America. And I, when I wrote my piece, I must say I underestimated the degree to which a lot of people, including presumably quite a lot of the people who will be coming to this rally, actually think that they are part of a movement. And I find that alarming. First of all, I find it a terrible waste that people are getting all excited about make-believe politics when there's, this thing called real politics that they might be getting involved in. I think more than a few people have pointed out that it would sure be a lot more valuable if instead of coming to Washington, all these folks spent the weekend knocking on doors for Democratic candidates. But also it's just, what do we make of the fact that people think of this as a real movement of that consists entirely of mockery? I mean, I think that Colbert and Stewart work very well as comedy. I think that as politicians, they are quite unpleasant. They are committed to mocking the opposition, an acceptable tactic in satire, an unacceptable tactic when it's your only tactic in politics.
Well, I mean, I guess if you, I mean, obviously, I wouldn't call them politicians, but they're doing political analysis and observation, and they're doing it better than a lot of the press does it.
But
right, I mean, I think if you're upset with the banality of political commentary when you turn on, even MSNBC, let's say, so there's a way in which, particularly during the Bush years, but now as well, there's a way in which Stewart and Colbert kind of were getting at the truth of things in ways that the established forms of analysis and commentary didn't quite do. That's different from calling.
But what about all? Are you alarmed by all these people who think that they are in fact involved? That coming to this rally is a way of getting involved in politics?
Well, I mean, I think if you go to a rally and say, I want to be seen and I want to have a count, I want to be seen as showing what I stand for as my values, I don't think it matters whether that rally is organized by Jon Stewart or by, the heads of 50 Washington organizations.
Well, I guess we just are going to have to agree to disagree. I am a little more stiff-necked than you are, I think, about this whole notion of what we can.
This is great. I love being not. On
I do think it kind of cheapens political discourse, and I think that it distracts people from the real issues. I mean, you're not going to have Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert offering up a political program, and therefore it can't be real politics.
Well, no, you're not. But at the same time, I mean, you do have. I mean, they're not offering up a political program, but they are offering up a way of understanding and analyzing what's going on in the political world. That's not wrong. I mean, the fact, those moments where Jon Stewart has stepped out, and for example, when he dismantled Jim Cramer, when he took on Betsy McCoy. I mean, there's. I don't know if it's just more powerful because he's funnier or because he's stepping out of his usual mold or whatever, but there are times when he's done things that get at the truth in ways that I don't want to say the MSM, but sort of the established forms of how we do these things weren't quite able to do.
I guess I don't give it so much importance. I realize it did have that effect on the culture. Actually, what it was really like, it was like when Walter Cronkite would voice opinions. He did his famous piece about the Vietnam War, or when he said during the '68 convention, I think we've got a lot of thugs here. In his case, it wasn't that his usual role was being funny. It was that his usual role was being extremely poker-faced. But coming at it from different directions, they have this same impact. I'm not going to argue with you about this, kind of trivializing effect of cable chat and all that. But I do think at least the people who are on these cable chat shows believe in something. And I guess one thing I don't like about if forced to take Stewart and Colbert seriously, which one of the unfortunate things about this rally is that it does force us to do that when really they're not meant to be taken seriously. They're comedians.
Well,
but if forced to take them seriously, there is a too cool to care aspect to their aura that I find distasteful as politics, that's definitely in there too, I just don't think this is a particularly constructive way to look at politics. So anyway.
It's funny. I used to have the same feeling about Bill Maher. Like I hated that Bill Maher show in the '90s for the same reason. And now I find, now that we're watching all those clips, I'm sort of realizing, well, maybe there was something important going on there after all.
Yeah.
But I mean, everybody. I think it's sometimes a matter of taste. I mean, the first thing I would get rid of is the White House correspondence.
Oh, sign me up.
That crap and that kind of treating politics as comedy, but. I mean, there's something about that ability to combine, actual commitment. I mean, and they don't have a policy agenda, and they can't have a policy agenda, but there's a basic understanding of values, which, as you said, is a very thin version of liberalism, and
dare one say smug.
Question. And maybe a little smug, but we've had smugger versions of liberalism in our history. It's a little, it's a little smug. I don't know. Are you going to go now?
No, but as I said at the beginning of my piece, I'm going to have a house full of young relatives and their friends. You did, and my kids are ready to disown me for writing this piece, which I've actually never been on Stewart.
Doesn't actually go in that direction.
Right.
Yeah.
I've never been there. I was once about to be on Colbert. They canceled me, which is not. I should say this is not a motive for writing the piece. But
you're gonna have a book to sell. You're gonna have a book to sell pretty soon. So.
I know, but until they cancel, no. I mean, I would gladly go on the show. I think, like I said, I think it's a funny show. I would go on the show. I just wouldn't join the movement. But anyway, while I was, waiting to be on the show. My kids just sort of thought I had, grown 10 feet tall.
Right.
It was interesting. So anyway,
and how was it a major setback at home when you didn't make the show?
It was a setback. It was a setback for sure. Yeah. I had to find other ways to reestablish my moral authority. But anyway, let's move on to the midterms generally. I don't know if there's much left to say, but it is continuing to look bleak. One thing I cannot figure out is this isn't directly related. This is indirectly related to the midterms, which is who's the big spender in the midterms? We have two competing narratives. Here is today's New York Times. I'm holding it up.
Right.
The page one of the New York Times identifies the Chamber of Commerce as the big player, the top non-party spender in this election. But then, we really are dealing with competing realities in the American media. Here, on the Wall Street Journal, the big spender is the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees.
Right.
And I was not able, in quickly looking these over, to figure out how these two newspapers could be identifying two different groups as the lead non-party spender in these elections. Do you know the answer to this question?
I think I know the answer. The Times, I mean, I mean, the journal is looking basically at what you can see at the FEC. And the whole point of this year is there's an enormous amount of stuff going on that you're not going to see at the FEC. And because a lot of like the Karl Rove group, American Crossroads, is in some of the, I don't fully understand all the Chamber of Commerce affiliates. They're set up as 501c4 nonprofits, which means they're in a category where if you're a political committee, if you're like the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee or the kinds of committees we saw a couple of years ago, you're called a 527, and you have to report your donors eventually.
Right.
But if you're a C4, you don't have to report anything. So the new innovation is they're C4s. We don't have any idea.
But isn't that true of both Ask Me and the Chamber of Commerce?
Well, Ask Me is a distinct institution, and it is reporting its political contributions. The Chamber and American Crossroads, what the Times was doing was they were going into corporate disclosures. A lot of these companies, and it's actually, there's a little group called the Center for Political Accountability that's been encouraging companies to make these disclose. They've been using, proxy votes to actually disclose their political spending, even if it's not, actual contributions. These kinds of outside things. So the Times was putting together data from a lot of sources like that in order to come up with their estimate of what's going on. But the fact is, I mean, both of them are. I mean, it's all interesting and alarming developments. However, more money is still spent by candidates and by the committees, the Democratic Congressional Committee and Republican Congressional Committee and so forth, than by outside groups this year. I mean, I think we're beginning to see this kind of sea change with the emergence of both, big outside money and totally secret outside money. I mean, for every one of those
donors to the Chamber of Commerce don't have to.
They don't.
We know who the contributors to Ask Me are. The contributors to Ask Me are taxpayers.
Well, they're members of the union.
Taxpayers to members to the union.
Well, that's not really fair. I mean, they're members. They voluntarily agree, are paying dues or contributions to the union.
Right. But we don't know who the contributors are to the Chamber of Commerce. Right. And
we know
they are not, but they're not required to reveal them.
Right.
Now, a few weeks ago, I attended a New America presentation of the book Winner Take All Politics that you moderated, and. Winner Take All Politics is a new book by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson about how American politics has affected income inequality, and an interesting point that Paul Pearson made there was he said, everybody pays so much attention to campaign contributions, but that's not really how corporations wield power in Washington, D.C. They spend much more money on lobbying than they do on political campaigns, and that was a point that was in the New York Times piece. That this money pouring into the Chamber of Commerce, quite a lot of it is being spent. A lot of it is being spent on campaigns, but a lot of it is also being spent on lobbying.
Right. That is correct.
But
the two go together. I mean, there's there are coordinated for every lobbying effort. When Lockheed Martin wants government to buy the F-22 or whatever, there's a lobbying effort, and then they're moving money alongside it.
Right. But Pearson's point is that more of the actual dollars go into lobbying, and Pearson and Hacker's point in their book is that the income inequality trend, which began in the late 70s, was really the result of corporations deciding at the beginning of the 70s that the advent of the regulatory state was so terrifying that they had to massively ramp up their presence in Washington and their lobbying activity. So that was Pearson's ultimate point. But I thought this New York Times piece did illustrate nicely the importance of the Chamber of Commerce just as a lobbying powerhouse.
Oh, yeah. And especially, I mean, what's also interesting is the way in which these lobbying powerhouses have aligned themselves more completely with one party or another. And that changes, I think, a lot. If you go back, I mean, even in the Clinton healthcare period, the chamber started off, wanting to work on, in support of of health reform. They were, in a way, a little too close to the Clinton administration, which allowed some other business lobbies, like the National Federation of Independent Business, to kind of outflank them on the right.
Right. They were the corporate sellouts, right?
Right.
And NFIBs were the lean, mean Democrat haters.
Right. Now, if you're really a lobbyist, you probably shouldn't be completely tied into one party, because the two parties do tend to shift control. So you tend to have this funny, you have two ugly possibilities. One in which you have a lot of corporate Democrats who are sold out to, their donors and lobbyists, or whatever their relationships.
Tony Coelho syndrome. The Tony Coelho syndrome.
The Tony Coelho syndrome, where you basically make a choice. This is a wonderful book called Honest Graft by Brooks Jackson that came out in like the early '90s, maybe even late '80s, maybe even late '80s. Really about how basically Coelho, as the whip of the House, went to the corporate establishment and said, "Look, we're going to run the House of Representatives, and you might as well back us up, and we'll look out for you." And of course, the end result was they didn't really run the House of Representatives for 5 years later. They were out. You have that choice, or you have this massive wave of money pouring down on you, and they kind of go back and forth. There's an interesting thing going on right now in the Veterans of Foreign Wars, where the VFW had endorsed some Democrats who've been, basically incredibly good on veterans issues. They've been really aggressive about, funding for post-traumatic stress syndrome and a lot of the things affecting veterans coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as older veterans. I mean, they're really perfect on all their issues, and they basically, in the way Washington works, is you're supposed to get a reward for that. And I think the VFW was even going to endorse, or did endorse, Barbara Boxer. Now there's kind of a backlash against that, basically saying, we need to be on the side of Republicans. But of course, the same thing happens when Sierra Club or NARAL endorses Republicans like Lincoln Chafee.
Of course, they don't really have that's not a very big problem anymore, because there aren't any more Republicans like Lincoln Chafee.
There aren't any more, but it's sort of an interest, from a lobbying perspective, you really do have to reward your friends. And especially you have to reward your friends from the other party, because otherwise you won't have any. I mean, there's no, if you go to if I'm an environmental lobbyist and I go to a Republican and say, we really want your vote on, on cap and trade, and he says, but you're going to, basically you're going to do everything you can to defeat me anyway. Why should I do anything for you? You don't have a good answer.
And what's happening now is not what you're describing. What's happening is the Chamber of Commerce and business interests generally, they're putting all their chips on the Republican Party, even though, at least, for the next, few weeks anyway, the White House, the House and the Senate are all controlled by the Democrats. They don't. And why is that? I mean, is it? I can off the top of my head, I can think of a few reasons. One is that they figure that the House is going to go Republican, and they would like to make that happen because all things being equal, they would prefer Republicans to be in power. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that they really do hate healthcare reform, which has never made a great deal of sense to me, since healthcare reform vastly expands the market for health insurers and also opens the door for businesses to get out of healthcare, direct healthcare coverage themselves.
They ought to. I mean, healthcare is one of the best things. Healthcare reform is one of the best things that ever happened to America. Status quo was not good.
And then a third possibility, I would imagine, if I were, what a conservative would say is that this is an anti-business administration. One does hear that accusation a lot. It's even in John Alter's book about Barack Obama. Not that he doesn't say that it's an anti-business administration, but he is struck by the fact that there are very few people from the business world in the Obama White House. So what do you think of those relative theories?
Well, I mean, I think it is a feeling of momentum and being there at the start when the Republicans assume power in the House, mm-hmm. and they have a huge and gambling that it's better off for them to have a huge debt and a strong, solid connection to the chamber and some of its constituent groups. I mean, obviously, if you talk to people in business, there is this kind of sense of betrayal, and this is an anti-business administration. You see that. I mean, there was a piece in the Hotline the other day that I kind of made fun of about how they feel like they were shocked and their feelings were hurt by the way healthcare and cap and trade were done. But I mean, I don't know what people expected from Obama. I mean, these were I think it's a perfectly pro-business administration, and B, none of this was. It's not a surprise that healthcare and cap and trade were on the agenda. The things that were not on the agenda were things like the things like TARP and the auto bailout that people didn't fully understand were going to have to happen, which were mostly pretty much pro-business. I think they see those things. I think the psychology of that kind of, especially Wall Street, that kind of coming hat in hand to Washington, I think it was kind of traumatizing, and then they kind of walk away and feel like, well, we never really needed Washington, and they meddled with us, kind of forgetting what actually happened there. So I think there's a little of that, but I think mostly it's just very cynical politics, and I'd like it to be, apart from partisan preferences, I hope it's kind of stupid politics. I hope that they're left with sort of egg on their face and feeling like they don't have, that they've cut their ties with Democrats and Democrats remain in control. That would be a good outcome, I think, for just in terms of equality of power.
It would be a great outcome. I think it's an unlikely outcome. I have been saying all year that I didn't think the House was going to go Republican, and I must confess this has become a steadily more difficult argument to make as we've gotten closer to Election Day, and the projections still seem to be that the House will go Republican. I find it as we get whenever I make predictions as we get closer to the event itself, I find that I give up my independent streak and I start saying, well, there's just not time anymore.
Right,
it's got to be whatever the conventional wisdom is at this point.
And as you get closer, the polls actually matter more, and and there isn't enough time, and people who weren't paying attention start to pay attention, so that which makes the polls more accurate. I don't know. I still think there's some chance of the Democrats holding the House. Obviously, it's a ton of individual races, but I'm struck that there hasn't been the things that kind of stoked voter frustration and anger earlier in the year. Have all stopped. And, you see Obama's approval ratings changing. All you have out there is the economy. There's not a thing there's nothing in the system right now that's driving it. There's not new scandals. There's not legislation that people are unhappy about. I feel like that's actually kind of a significant thing. I mean, I worked on the Hill in '94, and a lot of the things that were driving it, like the crime bill, really came up pretty close to the election itself.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stoking of the anger. Really, they're probably out by this point, but really into October, and it's been a long time since you've heard anything out of Washington.
This gives us a segue into the economy and the foreclosure crisis, which is the economic crisis du jour. It does not seem to have translated much. Sorry, that is my. I have a bird clock that is chirping there for a moment. The foreclosure crisis doesn't seem to have really become a political issue. I guess it would be hard to make it one, partly because the Democrats, the Obama administration doesn't want to touch this one with a 10-foot pole, which I think, as someone who's been covering the foreclosure crisis from the consumer point of view, I think that has actually emboldened the banks to do very little about this problem. I think that there was a brief moment there when they thought they were going to get their head handed to them by the feds, and it didn't happen. And so, for example, the Bank of America suspended all of its foreclosures nationwide. They announced, on the 18th that after 2.5 weeks, they had been through they had reviewed 102,000 foreclosures and decided it was all copacetic. And it seems pretty unlikely that they did that in any kind of meaningful way. What seems the reality is they figured out, they put their heads down figuring they were sure to catch it from the Obama administration. When the Obama administration got all mealy-mouthed about everything, they thought, well, then, we don't really have to engage in the symbolism anymore. We can just proceed with our foreclosures. Do you think it is possible in the next 2 weeks that this will become a political issue?
Well, I don't. I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things that's obviously, as with the subprime crisis, especially in its early stages, it's concentrated in some communities. It's really concentrated, and different communities are affected in different ways. I don't know. I mean, there's a sense. I mean, John Judas wrote the piece yesterday, basically saying this is, as writing it as if it's a government-caused crisis. I'm not sure that people are going to see it right away as something the government is doing, although people often do. I mean, obviously, I do think like when health insurance rates go up, people are going to see it as something the government did to them.
I didn't see the Judas piece. What did Judas argue?
Well, he basically said his headline was Obama is foreclosing on people. It's terrible politics and terrible policy, and he wrote it as if you should treat this as if it is the government's decision to do these foreclosures.
But through its failure to crack down on the banks,
to crack down and to do even a short-term moratorium, and then he had a substantive argument, and the substantive argument was that whatever Geithner's case against the moratorium, it's a reasonable case against a long-term moratorium, but not against a shorter-term moratorium. I mean, it was more of a substantive argument after that. But what was interesting about it was treating it as to treat it as a political issue, it has to be seen as a government act, and he was basically saying this is implicitly a government act, but I don't think it's quite seen that way. And of course, I think it's important to have some areas where we see. I mean, part of what I think Obama and the Democrats are dealing with now is that mistrust of all institutions becomes mistrust of government.
Right.
And I think if people say, goddamn Bank of America and those capitalist pigs, they stink. That's in a way that's not. At least it's drawing some distinctions among the institutions in which we don't have. It's not like that's not to say you suddenly do have more trust in government, but at least it's a different.
Problem is nobody knows who the chairman of the bank. Even I do. Who is the chairman of Bank of America?
CEO of Bank of America. Yeah,
I should know this. I don't, and certainly they don't know what that person looks like. Sorry, who is it?
Right. It's in Too Big to Fail. They're based in Charlotte now. They're not.
Right.
They're not.
Well, the mortgage part is based in Charlotte.
No, all of it.
All of it.
Bank of America got taken over by that bank that came out of Charlotte, and then they took the Bank of America name.
Oh, okay.
It's no longer the legendary old San Francisco company that you knew. It's just
right. Well, there's the difficulty right there. Is people are furious at institutions and elites, and what's the most recognizable institution or elite? It's not any particular corporate chief. It's the President of the United States.
Right. And he's taken all of it, and they know that, and then they can dump a lot of money into elections. He gets blamed for their screw ups, and then they can dump a lot of money into elections to cripple him.
I also wonder if David Axelrod hasn't been saying in the White House, look, remember the Tea Party? Remember how the Tea Party started? It was one idiot on CNBC screaming and yelling about how we were being too nice to people who were defaulting on their mortgages. So don't go near people who are defaulting on their mortgages.
Right. I think it's stuff. I think it's very complicated stuff to. I think you just don't want this stuff right before an election.
Right.
That's the problem. You just don't want it. I'm being completely cynical when I say that. I mean, they ought to have a moratorium. There's no question about it on the policy grounds. But I think on pure political grounds, it's probably better to just let it not be the government's problem. I mean, all these things have become, the auto industry became the government's problem, Wall Street became the government's problem. For the time being, at least, and eventually this will become the government's problem. But for the time being, at least, if I were an advisor in the White House, I'd probably say, don't touch it.
Right, but I think they'll probably have to touch it pretty soon after Election Day, and I'm not convinced that they will. I think their natural instinct before this crisis was to whatever the banks want, they get, and I think that will be their instinct for a while, even after Election Day.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing for the most anti-business administration in history.
It is pretty amazing.
The most sell-out to business, anti-business administration there's ever been. Taking it from all sides. All right, we should wrap this up. The one topic we were going to talk about was the firing of Juan Williams.
Right, and I will just say very briefly, I think it stinks. I should say I am a friend of Juan's, so there's that caveat. He was my neighbor for many years. Looking at what Juan said, it seems to me insane that that's something you would fire someone for. I did think there was a very strong parallel with what Shirley Sherrod said. He was describing his own personal shortcomings in experiencing fear when he sees a Muslim on a plane, and I think that the only shocking thing there was that he said he was a human being. Then he went on to say, in effect, this is not America's problem, this is my problem, and because it is absolutely unfair to think that way, and Muslims did not attack us on 9/11, certain extremists did. And so it is very much a similar kind of parable to what Shirley Sherrod told at the NAACP, and I think the NPR panicked in a similar way after there were some protests. I think Progress, which made us think about this, did not cover itself with glory. I'm a little bit appalled by the way they demagogued this. I think they didn't expect him to get fired, but they did. I think they are guilty of taking his comments out of context, and I think it did not reflect well on NPR. And I'm sorry to see my friend Juan now spending 100% of his time on Fox News as opposed to 50%.
Right. I mean, to me, he's not somebody that I know. He's somebody I think of as somebody I admired his writing a long time ago and have kind of grown, and it kind of seems a little tiresome and conventional to me when I see him either on Fox or hear him on NPR. I think that there's an implication, certainly in what NPR is saying, that this was not actually the crime, that this was the straw that broke the camel's back or something, that there was a whole series of reasons to fire him in a way, I think, similar to Rick Sanchez, maybe from CNN, which means that from outside, you can't really judge a full range of anybody's personnel decisions. However, if that's the case, right, you shouldn't create the impression that it's firing over this statement, which I agree with you is not in and of itself not something anybody should.
Also, how come Mara Liasson gets a free pass here? If the offense is appearing on Fox News shows,
right. Well, there's a campaign. There's a Get Mara campaign going on also. I mean, that's sort of one. It's sort of interesting to me when I watch. I was kind of thinking about it, how I often watch them on Fox and I hear them on NPR, and I feel like there's such a on Fox. It's really hard to just sort of, even though they are sort of the token non-conservatives, I guess. I won't even use the word don't. I mean, they're there because they're not conservatives. They're there to provide a different perspective. But you're spending so much time, in this kind of being nice and not disagreeing that much with Fred Barnes, or in Williams' case, O'Reilly. I don't know. It almost kind of affects you. I was thinking, like I love doing blogging heads with people who are conservative. I did it a couple weeks ago with Ramesh Ponnuru. I like doing that. I like doing, it's good to have the variety. But I almost feel like I behave in a certain way. Like I'm not inclined to get in a screaming match all the time. Sometimes I will, but I'm not inclined to pick every fight. So if I did that for 2 hours every day, I would change my tone.
That could be spun.
I'd probably be less insightful about American politics because I'd be trimming everything.
That could be spun in a good way, or it could be spun in a bad way.
Obviously, sometimes people
could say that you are better able to engage in focus on the substantive disagreement, and filter out the noise, the kind of cultural noise that surrounds it. That would be the good part. The bad part would be that you become quietly brainwashed by your opposition. But then you can also be brainwashed in another way by just talking to people you agree with. That was the argument against journalists.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right.
So what we really should do is all of us let's not
go there.
Let's never talk to anybody. Is what we should do. We should all take vows of silence and enter monasteries.
Or,
No, then they'll make me soft on Stewart and Colbert.
We'll learn a lot from them. Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
All right, well, on that happy note.
All right, very good, Ted. Very nice to do this with you.
Okay.
Next time we'll do it with some conservatives.